Prosecutor Calls, black woman just a civilian. Until the NSA confirmed her identity in court. You're just a civilian. Stay out of this. Those were the prosecutor's sharp words to a quiet woman sitting in the back of the courtroom. He thought he had complete control over the trial of a notorious cybercriminal, a man accused of hacking into the nation's most secure systems. But what he didn't know was that the woman he dismissed wasn't ordinary at all. She was a high-ranking NSA agent with secrets that would turn the entire trial on its head. What happens when arrogance meets quiet power? Stay tuned, because this story will leave you speechless. The wooden benches of the Washington, D.C. courtroom creaked faintly as people shifted in their seats, waiting for the trial to resume. It was a high-profile case, and every eye seemed glued to the defendant. A slick, arrogant man in a tailored suit, accused of orchestrating one of the largest cyber heists in recent history. His name was Viktor Reznov, and while the media branded him a mastermind hacker, the government quietly classified him as a serious national threat. Sitting among the crowd, Alicia Monroe adjusted the cuffs of her crisp navy blue blazer. She wasn't flashy, nor did she draw attention to herself. Her brown skin and tightly coiled hair pulled into a neat bun complemented her composed demeanor. To most, she looked like another interested spectator, someone curious about the legal drama unfolding in the courtroom. No one would have guessed she was carrying a badge tucked discreetly inside her leather bag, stamped with the seal of the National Security Agency. Alicia scanned the room, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. She noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Victor and his defense attorney, the way they leaned slightly toward one another whenever the prosecutor spoke. She had been trained to recognize body language, and these movements practically screamed they were preparing a counterattack. The prosecution had no idea what was coming. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his voice booming through the room. Everyone rose as Judge Eleanor Graves, an older woman with a steely gaze, entered and took her seat. As the trial resumed, Daniel Cromwell, the lead prosecutor, strode confidently to the center of the courtroom. His reputation preceded him, ruthless, ambitious, and utterly self-assured. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, he looked every bit the part of a man who relished the spotlight. He began his cross-examination with theatrical flair, his voice slicing through the air as he interrogated one of Victor's accomplices. "You expect this court to believe that you, a man with no prior technical expertise, were coerced into participating in an elaborate hacking scheme?" Daniel's voice dripped with sarcasm as he paced in front of the witness stand. The witness, a wiry man with trembling hands, stammered a response, but Daniel cut him off before he could finish. Alicia felt her jaw tighten. She had seen this tactic before, the way prosecutors like Daniel used intimidation to throw witnesses off balance. It worked in most cases, but Alicia wasn't here to be impressed. She was here to observe, and, if necessary, intervene. The cross-examination dragged on, with Daniel delivering scathing remarks that earned murmurs of approval from the audience. Alicia noticed Victor's smug smile, the subtle tap of his fingers against the table. He was far too confident for someone on trial for federal crimes. It wasn't arrogance, it was preparation. Her suspicions were confirmed during a brief recess. As the attorneys shuffled papers and the judge left the room, Alicia leaned toward one of the defense attorneys seated nearby. She kept her voice low, but firm. "They're stalling," she said. "Reznov is waiting for something. A delay. Maybe an error in the prosecutor's approach. Watch his hands when the trial resumes. He's signaling." The attorney, a young woman named Rachel Grant, gave Alicia a skeptical glance. "And you are?" "An observer," Alicia replied, her tone neutral but pointed. "Just trust me on this." Rachel hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. Alicia sat back, her face impassive, as the courtroom buzzed with muted conversations. That was when Daniel noticed her. He had been reviewing his notes, but the exchange between Alicia and Rachel caught his eye. With a sharp, irritated look, he approached Alicia, towering over her as she remained seated. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. I couldn't help but notice you offering unsolicited advice to the defense. Do you mind explaining what exactly you're doing here? Alicia met his gaze calmly. I'm observing, she said simply. Observing? Daniel scoffed, drawing the attention of several nearby reporters. And what makes you qualified to observe a federal case? Are you a journalist, a lawyer, or just someone who wandered in off the street? The courtroom fell silent, all eyes now on the exchange. Alicia's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a quiet warning. I'm here on behalf of an interested party, she replied carefully, choosing her words with precision. Let's leave it at that. But Daniel wasn't satisfied. He stepped closer, his voice rising. An interested party? This isn't a school debate club. This is federal court. People like you don't get to interfere in matters you clearly don't understand. So if you'd kindly refrain from playing legal expert, I'd appreciate it. Alicia's lips pressed into a thin line. She could feel the heat of the room, the way Daniel's words hung in the air like a challenge. Every instinct told her to put him in his place, to pull out her badge and watch his arrogance crumble. But not yet. Timing was everything. Instead, she stood, meeting Daniel's gaze head-on. Her voice was calm but firm, each word carefully measured. Thank you for your advice, Mr. Cromwell. I'll keep that in mind. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned silence. Daniel smirked, clearly pleased with himself. But as Alicia exited the courthouse, her mind was already working. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. It's me, she said. We've got a problem. Cromwell's ego might cost us this case. I'll need clearance to step in sooner than planned. The voice on the other end gave a curt response, and Alicia nodded. Understood, I'll be ready. As she ended the call, she looked back at the courthouse, her sharp eyes narrowing. Daniel Cromwell had no idea what he had just unleashed. The courtroom bustled with quiet activity as the next day's session began. Attorneys shuffled papers, reporters whispered to one another, and the audience filed into the gallery. Daniel Cromwell, still riding high from his perceived victory the day before, stood by the prosecution table, gesturing animatedly to his colleagues. His voice carried just enough for others to overhear. People like that don't belong in federal court, Daniel sneered. She probably thought she was clever, whispering nonsense to the defense. It's amateur hour with civilians like her. A ripple of laughter echoed among his peers. Daniel relished the attention, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His eyes darted briefly toward the back of the courtroom, scanning for the woman he had humiliated. She wasn't there, and the thought filled him with smug satisfaction. Meanwhile, Alicia Monroe sat in her office at the NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, staring at the glowing screen of her computer. Her office was unassuming, with walls adorned only by a few framed commendations and a world map dotted with pins marking significant operations she had overseen. On her desk was a single file, Viktor Reznov's. She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her lip. Alicia had spent years tracking Reznov, watching as he slipped through legal loopholes and evaded international authorities. His cybercrimes weren't just about money. They had far-reaching implications, from hacking defense systems to selling classified information to foreign powers. This trial was her agency's chance to close the net on him once and for all. But Cromwell was jeopardizing everything. Alicia had seen it before. Prosecutors who let their egos cloud their judgment. They treated cases like performances, prioritizing personal glory over justice. Cromwell didn't see the larger picture. To him, Reznov was just another defendant, and the trial was another opportunity to bask in the limelight. He had no idea how deep the stakes ran. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. Alicia picked it up and glanced at the caller ID, Agent Carter, her deputy. They're making a move, Carter said without preamble. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Reznov's defense team filed a motion to exclude the evidence we provided to the DOJ. They're claiming it was obtained without proper warrants. Alicia's jaw tightened. It was exactly what she had feared. Cromwell's sloppy courtroom tactics had given the defense an opening. If the evidence was excluded, Reznov could walk. I'm going to the courthouse, Alicia said, her voice firm. "We can't let this spiral out of control." "Understood," Carter replied. "Do you want backup?" "No," she said. "This is something I need to handle personally." By the time Alicia arrived at the courthouse, the session was already underway. She slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back of the gallery. Cromwell was in his element, pacing in front of the jury as he presented his arguments. His tone was confident, his gestures dramatic. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the defense's motion holds no water," he declared, smirking as if he had already won. "Their claim of improper procedure is a desperate attempt to distract from the overwhelming evidence against their client." Alicia watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She could see through the performance. He wasn't addressing the jury. He was performing for the cameras, ensuring his words would make headlines the next day. But the defense attorney, Rachel Grant, was unfazed. She rose from her seat, her face calm and composed. "Your Honor," Rachel began, addressing Judge Graves, "the prosecution's evidence was obtained through methods that violate both federal and constitutional standards. We have reason to believe it was collected by an agency operating outside the scope of this court's authority." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Alicia's eyes narrowed. Rachel was playing a dangerous game, and she was playing it well. By questioning the legitimacy of the evidence, she was forcing Cromwell into a corner. Daniel's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Your Honor, these accusations are baseless. The evidence was provided by a federal agency with full legal authority to conduct its operations." "And yet," Rachel countered, "the prosecution has failed to produce documentation proving that proper warrants were issued. If this court allows such evidence, it sets a dangerous precedent." The judge leaned forward, her steely gaze sweeping across both attorneys. "I'll need to review the evidence and the motion in full before making a ruling. Court is adjourned until tomorrow." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, and people began filing out. Alicia remained seated, watching as Daniel stormed back to his table, gathering his papers in a huff. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a simmering frustration. As the room emptied, Alicia rose and approached the prosecution table. Daniel looked up, his expression hardening as he recognized her. "You," he said, his voice low and venomous. "What are you doing back here? Come to offer more unsolicited advice?" Alicia didn't flinch. She placed her hands on the edge of the table, leaning in slightly. Her voice was calm but laced with steel. "I came to warn you, Cromwell. Your ego is costing us this case." Daniel scoffed. "Us? There's no us. You're just a civilian. You don't understand the complexities of—" "I understand more than you think," Alicia interrupted, her eyes locking onto his. "I understand that Viktor Reznov isn't just another criminal. He's connected to operations that you can't even begin to comprehend. And if you don't stop treating this trial like a stage for your personal glory, you're going to let him walk." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Alicia cut him off. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to ensure justice is served, and whether you like it or not, you're going to need my help." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing there, speechless. He watched her go, a mix of anger and confusion on his face. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Who was this woman? And what was she hiding? Alicia stepped out into the brisk afternoon air, her mind racing. She knew she had taken a risk confronting Daniel, but there was no time for subtlety. Reznov was playing the long game, and if she didn't act quickly, the consequences could be catastrophic. As she walked to her car, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. "Carter," she said when the line connected. "It's time. Get me full clearance to take over this operation." There was a pause on the other end before Carter replied, "Are you sure? Cromwell isn't going to like it." Alicia's voice was steady. "He doesn't have to like it. He just has to get out of the way." Hanging up, she stared at the courthouse behind her, the weight of the coming battle settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about Reznov anymore. It was about dismantling the arrogance and incompetence threatening the justice system itself. The corridors of the courthouse echoed with the rhythmic click of Alicia Monroe's heels as she walked with purpose. She had spent the morning on calls, maneuvering through the labyrinth of bureaucratic protocols to secure the clearance she needed. Now, as she approached the courtroom once again, she was ready to take the gloves off. The day had been grueling, the kind where every moment felt heavy with anticipation. Alicia's crisp navy blazer fit perfectly over her tailored slacks. But it wasn't her attire that turned heads as she entered the courtroom. It was her demeanor, calm, controlled, and commanding. She exuded authority, a stark contrast to the frenzied energy of the trial's participants. The gallery filled quickly, the whispers of reporters and spectators blending into a low hum. At the prosecution table, Daniel Cromwell stood in animated discussion with his team, his voice too loud and too insistent. Alicia noticed how his hand lingered on the back of his chair, gripping it tighter than necessary, a telltale sign of his rising tension. She smirked inwardly. His confidence was cracking. As she sat quietly near the back, a member of her team, Agent Carter, slipped into the seat beside her. He handed her a manila folder without a word, the thick packet of documents containing the ammunition she needed to steer the trial back on track. Alicia thumbed through it, her eyes scanning lines of text filled with technical jargon, timestamps, and classified details. Every piece of evidence had been meticulously gathered, and now it was time to bring it to light. "Everything is in place," Carter whispered, his voice barely audible over the courtroom's buzz. "Good," Alicia replied, closing the folder and placing it neatly in her lap. "Stay close. This is about to get interesting." The gavel struck sharply, silencing the room as Judge Eleanor Graves took her seat. The air felt charged, as though everyone in the courtroom could sense the shift in tone. Daniel stood first, striding confidently to the center of the room to address the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "The defense's motion to exclude evidence lacks merit. The prosecution has acted within the full scope of federal law. Any suggestion otherwise is a baseless attempt to undermine the integrity of this case." Judge Graves raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Miss Grant," she said, turning to the defense attorney, "you may respond." Rachel Grant rose gracefully, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Daniel's bluster. "Your Honor, we stand by our assertion that the evidence in question was obtained through improper means. Without proper documentation proving otherwise, this court cannot consider it admissible." The room buzzed with tension as the judge leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen thoughtfully against the desk. Before she could speak, Alicia stood, her measured movements drawing every eye in the room. "Your Honor," Alicia said, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence. "If I may, I believe I can clarify this matter." All heads turned, including Daniel's, his eyes narrowing in annoyance. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he protested. "This observer has no standing in this court." Judge Graves held up a hand, silencing him. "And yet she seems to have information relevant to the case, Mr. Cromwell. Miss Monroe, you may proceed." Alicia stepped forward, the folder in her hand. She placed it on the judge's desk with deliberate care, her movements slow enough to build anticipation. "In this folder, Your Honor, you will find the necessary documentation proving the evidence was obtained with proper warrants and oversight. It includes signatures from both a federal magistrate and the director of the National Security Agency." The room erupted into murmurs. Alicia's calm delivery stood in stark contrast to the ripple of disbelief spreading through the courtroom. Judge Graves opened the folder, her sharp eyes scanning the contents. The room was silent again, every breath held as they awaited her reaction. After a long pause, she nodded. "This appears to be in order," she said, her voice neutral but firm. "The motion to exclude evidence is denied." The defense table stiffened, Rachel's composed mask faltering for just a moment. Meanwhile, Daniel's shoulders straightened, his smugness returning. He turned to Alicia, a condescending smile playing at his lips. "Thank you for finally contributing something useful," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "I suppose even a civilian can stumble onto something valuable once in a while." Alicia's gaze didn't waver. She stepped closer, her voice low but clear. "You still don't get it, do you, Mr. Cromwell?" Daniel frowned. "Get what?" "That I'm not here to serve you or your ego," she replied, her tone steady and cutting. "I'm here because your incompetence almost cost us this case. You're too blinded by your arrogance to see the bigger picture." Daniel's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You think you're better than me? Just because you dug up a few papers?" "I didn't just dig up papers," Alicia interrupted, her voice rising just enough to command attention. "I've been leading this operation for over 2 years. I'm the one who coordinated the surveillance, the intelligence gathering, and the evidence collection that landed Viktor Reznov in this courtroom. And I'm the one who will ensure he doesn't walk free because of your recklessness." The courtroom fell deathly silent. Daniel's face turned red, a mixture of embarrassment and fury contorting his features. Before he could respond, Judge Graves cleared her throat. "Miss Monroe," the judge said, her tone firm but curious, "would you care to clarify your role in this case?" Alicia turned to face the judge, her posture straight and unwavering. "Your Honor, I am Deputy Director of Operations for the National Security Agency. My team has been tracking Viktor Reznov as part of an international counterintelligence operation. The evidence presented in this case was gathered under my direct supervision." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Rachel Grant looked stunned, her composed exterior cracking as she exchanged frantic whispers with her team. Daniel, for once, was speechless. "I believe that should clear up any doubts about the legitimacy of the evidence," Alicia said, turning back to the judge. "If there are any further questions, I'd be happy to answer them." Judge Graves leaned forward, her sharp gaze fixed on Alicia. "That will not be necessary, Deputy Director. Thank you for your clarification." Alicia nodded and returned to her seat, the weight of her revelations settling over the room like a heavy fog. Daniel remained frozen, his mind racing as he tried to process what had just happened. For the first time in his career, he realized he might not be the smartest person in the room, and it terrified him. As Alicia sat, Agent Carter leaned toward her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You just broke him," he whispered. Alicia's gaze remained fixed on the front of the courtroom. "Not yet," she murmured, "but I will." The courtroom remained unnervingly quiet even after Judge Graves adjourned for a recess. Alicia could feel the weight of dozens of eyes trailing her as she calmly gathered her things and prepared to step out. The revelation of her position at the NSA had created ripples that were now turning into waves. Whispers rose in the gallery, speculation running rampant. Who was this woman who had so effortlessly disarmed both the defense and the prosecution in a single move? But Alicia wasn't here for the spectacle. She had bigger battles ahead. As she exited the courtroom, Agent Carter walked briskly beside her, his tall frame keeping pace with her measured strides. "You know," he began, his voice low enough to avoid attracting attention, "I've seen you pull off some moves before, but this? I think you just gave half the room heart palpitations." Alicia's lips twitched, a faint hint of a smile breaking through her otherwise serious demeanor. "Good. It's about time they realized what's at stake here." The two turned into a quieter hallway, away from the prying eyes of reporters and spectators. Carter glanced over his shoulder, ensuring they weren't being followed, then leaned in slightly. "Cromwell's not going to take this lying down." Alicia stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "I'm counting on it." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You're provoking him on purpose." "Not provoking," Alicia corrected, her voice steady. "Exposing. Men like Cromwell thrive on their own self-image. He's used to being the smartest person in the room, the one who always has the upper hand. But now that illusion's been shattered, and he's going to make mistakes trying to rebuild it." Carter let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." Alicia allowed herself a brief smile, but her mind was already back in the courtroom. She knew Daniel Cromwell wouldn't let her presence go unanswered. He would lash out, publicly or privately, and when he did, she'd be ready. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in a cramped conference room near the courtroom, his team of junior attorneys seated awkwardly around the table. Papers were scattered across the polished wood, and the tension in the room was palpable. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the table as he replayed the events of the morning in his mind. "That woman," he muttered, his voice tight with anger. "Who does she think she is, waltzing into my courtroom and undermining me like that?" One of his junior attorneys, a young man with glasses perched precariously on his nose, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, she's the Deputy Director of Operations at the NSA. That's not exactly—" "I know who she is," Daniel snapped, cutting him off. "I don't care about her title or her credentials. This is my case, and she's making it look like I can't handle it." The room fell silent. No one dared to speak, knowing that Daniel's temper was on the edge of boiling over. After a moment, he stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room like a caged animal. "She's trying to undermine me," he continued, his voice rising, "to make me look incompetent. Well, I won't let her. I'm going to show her, and everyone else in that courtroom, that I'm still in control." One of his more experienced colleagues, Linda Caldwell, folded her arms and leaned back in her chair. "Daniel, with all due respect, this isn't about you. It's about the case. If Monroe has evidence that strengthens our position, we should be working with her, not against her." Daniel stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing. "You don't get it, Linda. People are watching. My reputation is on the line here." "And what about justice?" Linda countered, her tone sharp. "You know the reason we're supposed to be here?" Daniel opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his jaw tightening. Linda's words stung because he knew deep down that she was right, but admitting that would mean conceding that Alicia Monroe had a point, and his ego wouldn't allow it. Back in the hallway, Alicia leaned against a marble column, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee from the courthouse cafe. She watched as people moved past, their faces a mix of curiosity and indifference. To them, she was just another bureaucrat in a sea of government officials. But she liked it that way. The less attention she drew, the more effective she could be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching. She turned to see Rachel Grant, the defense attorney, walking toward her with a determined expression. "Miss Monroe," Rachel said, stopping a few feet away. Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to it. "May I have a word?" Alicia raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Of course." Rachel folded her arms, her stance firm but not confrontational. "You threw a wrench into my case this morning. I'd like to know why." "Because the truth matters," Alicia replied simply. "And the truth is, your client isn't just a hacker. He's a national security threat. This isn't about winning or losing a trial. It's about protecting lives." Rachel frowned, clearly not satisfied with the answer. "You're saying my client is dangerous, but all I've seen so far is circumstantial evidence and hearsay. If there's more, why isn't it being presented?" Alicia studied her for a moment, considering her next words carefully. "Because some of it is classified, and because this trial is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But trust me when I say, your client is exactly where he belongs. On the other side of that courtroom." Rachel's eyes narrowed, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "And what about Cromwell? You really think he's capable of handling a case this complex?" Alicia allowed herself a small, wry smile. "Let's just say I'm here to make sure he doesn't screw it up." Rachel blinked, clearly taken aback by Alicia's candor. For a moment, the two women regarded each other in silence. Then Rachel nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "All right," she said, "but don't expect me to back down. My job is to defend my client, and I intend to do it." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Alicia replied, her tone steady. "Just make sure you're prepared for what's coming." With that, Rachel turned and walked away, leaving Alicia alone once more. She finished her coffee and tossed the cup into a nearby trash can. The pieces were moving into place, and the next move would be hers. As she walked back toward the courtroom, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from Carter. "Cromwell's digging. He's asking questions about you." Alicia's lips curved into a faint smile. "Let him," she muttered under her breath. "He's about to learn the hard way that this isn't his game to play." With her resolve steeled, she pushed open the doors to the courtroom, ready for whatever came next. The battle was far from over, but Alicia Monroe was nothing if not patient. She had spent years mastering the art of control, and now it was time to use it. The courtroom had taken on a strange energy as the session resumed, the kind of tension that simmered just below the surface, waiting for the slightest provocation to erupt. Alicia Monroe felt it as she stepped through the heavy double doors and took her seat in the gallery. Her presence was no longer anonymous. Every glance, every whispered word was aimed her way. But she ignored it all. This wasn't her first time navigating a room full of skeptical eyes. At the front of the room, Daniel Cromwell was already at the prosecution table, surrounded by papers and his junior attorneys. He was speaking in low, urgent tones, gesturing toward the evidence folder Alicia had introduced earlier. His posture was rigid, his movements sharp. A man trying to project confidence but unable to shake the cracks forming beneath the surface. From her seat, Alicia watched him carefully. She'd spent her career studying people like Cromwell, men who were so accustomed to control that even the slightest disruption in their narrative sent them spiraling. Today would be no different. The proceedings began with Judge Eleanor Graves calling the court to order. Her sharp gavel strike echoed through the room, silencing the murmurs that lingered after Alicia's earlier revelations. "Before we continue with the prosecution's case," the judge began, her tone even but firm, "I want to make it clear that this court will not tolerate any further disruptions or attempts to undermine the integrity of these proceedings. Is that understood, Mr. Cromwell?" Daniel looked up sharply, his jaw tightening at the subtle reprimand. "Of course, Your Honor," he said, his voice measured. Alicia noted the way his hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The warning had landed, but it wouldn't stop him from making a move. Men like Cromwell couldn't resist the need to reassert dominance, even when it cost them. The trial resumed with a key witness for the prosecution, a cybersecurity expert who had been brought in to explain the technical details of Viktor Reznov's hacking operations. The witness was young, eager, and clearly nervous under the weight of the courtroom's scrutiny. Daniel wasted no time stepping into his role, pacing confidently before the jury as he questioned the witness. He asked pointed, calculated questions, guiding the testimony to highlight the complexity and scope of Reznov's crimes. To his credit, Daniel's performance was polished, even commanding. For a moment, Alicia almost believed he was back in control. But she had seen the signs earlier, the way he had been flipping through his notes too quickly, the restless tapping of his pen. Daniel wasn't just building his case, he was building up to something, and Alicia knew she was at the center of it. Her suspicion was confirmed when Daniel turned abruptly toward the gallery, his sharp gaze locking onto her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. "Before we proceed further, I'd like to request some clarity regarding the involvement of Miss Alicia Monroe in this case." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Graves raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Cromwell, if you have concerns about Miss Monroe's role, I suggest you address them outside of this courtroom. This is neither the time nor the place for such inquiries." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Daniel pressed, "Miss Monroe's sudden appearance and the authority she's claimed raises questions about the validity of her involvement. After all, she presented herself initially as an observer, yet now she claims to represent the NSA. I believe the court and the jury have a right to understand her true intentions." Alicia remained perfectly still, her face a mask of calm. She had expected this move. In fact, she had been counting on it. Judge Graves sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose in frustration. "Miss Monroe," she said, her tone weary, "would you care to respond to the prosecution's concerns?" Alicia stood slowly, smoothing her blazer before stepping forward. She moved with deliberate precision, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and measured, "I understand Mr. Cromwell's curiosity regarding my role in this case. It's not every day that a representative of the NSA becomes involved in a federal trial. However, I assure this court that my involvement is both legal and necessary." She turned slightly, addressing the jury as well. "I was authorized by the director of the NSA to oversee the evidence presented in this trial because of the larger implications it holds for national security. Mr. Cromwell's attempts to frame my presence as disruptive or suspicious are unfounded. If he has further concerns, I'd be happy to address them in an appropriate setting. But I would suggest we not waste the court's time with theatrics." Her words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. For a moment, Daniel seemed to falter, his carefully constructed confidence wavering. But then he recovered, his smile tight and his eyes cold. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you speak of larger implications and national security, yet you fail to provide any concrete examples. If your agency is so deeply involved, why hasn't this case been elevated beyond a standard criminal trial? Perhaps it's because the evidence you've brought forward isn't as ironclad as you'd like us to believe." Alicia tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanging. She had dealt with men like Daniel before, men who mistook arrogance for intelligence, who underestimated the strength of silence. And now it was time to deliver the blow. "Mr. Cromwell," she said, her tone icy, "if you're questioning the integrity of the evidence, I'd be happy to have it reviewed by the President's legal counsel. After all, it was their office that signed off on its admissibility." The room erupted into murmurs once more, louder this time. Even the jury looked startled. Daniel's expression darkened, his composure slipping as he realized he had overplayed his hand. Judge Graves banged her gavel sharply, calling for order. "Enough," she said, her voice firm. "Mr. Cromwell, I suggest you refocus your efforts on the case at hand. This court will not tolerate further distractions." Daniel sat down stiffly, his face a mask of barely concealed fury. Alicia returned to her seat, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. She had given Daniel enough rope, and now he was starting to hang himself. As the trial continued, Alicia kept her focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Victor Reznov or Daniel Cromwell. It was about exposing the deeper flaws in a system that allowed arrogance and incompetence to jeopardize justice. And as far as Alicia was concerned, the reckoning had only just begun. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. What had once felt like a battle between the prosecution and the defense was now a delicate, precarious game of strategy. Every move, every word spoken carried weight. And at the center of it all, Daniel Cromwell sat at the prosecution table, his mind churning like a storm. He stared at the stack of papers in front of him, but the words blurred together. His jaw clenched, the embarrassment from Alicia Monroe's earlier remarks still stinging like an open wound. How dare she insinuate he didn't have control? He'd built his career on control, on power and precision. Yet for the first time, cracks were forming in the carefully constructed persona he had spent years cultivating. Behind him, Alicia sat in the gallery, her presence unyielding. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but her silence carried weight. It was deliberate, calculated. Daniel could feel her gaze even when he wasn't looking. It unnerved him, made him feel exposed in ways he couldn't explain. When the court adjourned for lunch, Alicia stayed behind, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood of the gallery bench. Agent Carter approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her without a word, then slid into the seat beside her. "You've got him rattled," Carter said quietly, taking a sip from his cup. Alicia didn't respond immediately. She watched Daniel as he gathered his papers and left the courtroom, his movements stiff and hurried. "He's starting to lose focus," she said finally. "But he's not done yet. Men like him don't implode quietly." Carter glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Do you think he'll lash out?" Alicia nodded, her expression calm but knowing. Of course, when someone like Cromwell feels threatened, they don't back down. They double down. He'll make another move, and when he does, we'll be ready. Later that afternoon, the trial resumed. The next witness was called to the stand, a former associate of Viktor Reznov who had agreed to testify in exchange for leniency. The man, Ethan Navarro, was a wiry figure with nervous energy, his eyes darting around the courtroom as if he expected Reznov to leap from his chair and attack him. Daniel's demeanor shifted as he approached the witness stand. His earlier embarrassment seemed to have faded, replaced by the polished, confident version of himself he was so adept at projecting. He smiled tightly at Ethan, his voice smooth and controlled as he began his questioning. "Mr. Navarro," Daniel said, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "you've admitted to being part of Mr. Reznov's operations. Can you describe the nature of your involvement?" Ethan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I handled logistics," he said, his voice trembling. "I set up the servers, managed the encryption protocols, stuff like that." Daniel nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And these servers, were they used to facilitate the cyber attacks on federal agencies?" Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously at Reznov, who sat impassively at the defense table. Yes, he said finally. "Reznov planned everything. I just followed orders." Daniel's voice hardened slightly. "Followed orders? So you're telling this court that you willingly participated in an operation that compromised national security, but you're somehow not responsible?" Ethan's face paled, and he stammered, I didn't know the full scope of what we were doing. Reznov didn't tell us everything." Daniel pounced on the hesitation, his voice rising. "So you were just an innocent bystander? Is that what you're claiming?" Alicia watched the exchange intently, her brow furrowing. Daniel's line of questioning was sharp, but it lacked nuance. He was treating Ethan like an enemy, pushing him into a defensive corner. It was a risky move. Witnesses like Ethan needed to feel safe to give truthful testimony. Alienating them only created openings for the defense. Sure enough, Rachel Grant seized the opportunity when it was her turn to cross-examine. "Mr. Navarro," Rachel began, her tone gentle but firm, "you mentioned earlier that you didn't know the full scope of Mr. Reznov's plans. Can you elaborate on that?" Ethan nodded quickly, his relief evident. "Yes, Reznov only told us what we needed to know. He kept everything compartmentalized. I didn't even know we were targeting federal systems until after it happened." Rachel smiled sympathetically. "So it's fair to say that you weren't a willing participant in these cyber attacks. You were manipulated by Mr. Reznov?" Ethan hesitated but then nodded. "Yes, that's right." Alicia felt a flicker of frustration as she watched the exchange. Rachel was reframing Ethan's testimony, painting him as a victim rather than a co-conspirator. And Daniel, blinded by his need to dominate the witness, had handed her the perfect opening. When the session ended for the day, Daniel stormed out of the courtroom, his face dark with anger. Alicia followed at a measured pace, her expression calm but thoughtful. She found him in the corridor outside, pacing like a restless predator. "Cromwell," she called, her voice cutting through the low hum of conversation in the hallway. He stopped and turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Monroe?" Alicia stepped closer, her hands tucked into her blazer pockets. "I want to know what your plan is," she said evenly. "Because whatever it is, it's not working." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't need advice from you." "No," Alicia said, her tone sharp. "You need results, and right now you're sabotaging your own case." Daniel's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job." "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Alicia shot back. "I'm telling you that your ego is getting in the way of justice. You're so focused on proving yourself that you're letting the defense run circles around you." Daniel stepped closer, his voice lowering to a harsh whisper. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you've got a fancy title and a badge? Well, let me tell you something, Monroe. You don't belong here. This is my case, and I'll win it my way." Alicia held his gaze, her expression unflinching. "And if you lose? What then?" What happens when Reznov walks because you were too blinded by your pride to see the bigger picture? For a moment, the two stood in tense silence, their words hanging heavy in the air. Then Daniel turned abruptly and walked away, leaving Alicia standing alone in the corridor. As she watched him go, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Carter. Reznov's team is making moves. Check your secure line ASAP. Alicia's jaw tightened. The stakes were rising, and the clock was ticking. If Daniel wouldn't get out of his own way, she'd have to do it for him. Because this wasn't just about winning a trial. It was about stopping a man who could bring an entire nation to its knees. And Alicia Monroe wasn't about to let that happen. Alicia rushed to her office at Fort Meade, her fingers flying over her secure terminal's keyboard, as Carter's message echoed in her mind. Reznov's defense team was too quiet, which meant only one thing. They were working an angle. Pulling up classified NSA surveillance logs, she scanned for any recent communication between Reznov's associates. A thread popped up. Encrypted messages sent to a known Russian operative flagged under an active counterintelligence operation. Alicia's stomach churned. Reznov wasn't just mounting a defense. He was leveraging his trial as a distraction, using the courtroom to shield his larger plan. The messages were coded, but the timestamps aligned with key developments in the trial. Alicia pieced it together. Reznov was stalling the trial to coordinate a new attack, a cyberstrike targeting the Department of Defense. Carter entered the room holding a tablet loaded with more data. You were right. Reznov's network lit up like a Christmas tree after his associate testified today. He's planning something big. Alicia nodded, her voice firm. We don't have time to wait for Cromwell to figure this out. Prep the team. We're shutting this operation down today. The next morning, Alicia returned to the courtroom, her resolve unshakable. She knew that if she waited for Daniel Cromwell to act, Reznov would slip through their fingers. The trial was now a race against time. Daniel stood at the prosecution table, visibly tense. He hadn't recovered from their last confrontation, and it showed in the stiffness of his posture. When Alicia approached, he glanced up, his expression wary. What now? He asked, his tone edged with irritation. Alicia placed a thin folder on the table. This is everything you've missed, she said evenly. Reznov isn't just defending himself in this trial. He's orchestrating a cyber attack in real time. These logs connect his defense team to encrypted communications with known operatives. If we don't act now, the consequences could be catastrophic. Daniel's face hardened. You're overstepping again. No, Alicia said, her voice sharp but calm. I'm doing your job because you're too busy fighting me instead of fighting him. Daniel opened the folder reluctantly, scanning the pages. His confidence faltered as he read, his face paling. This is real? Yes, Alicia replied. And we need to present this evidence now, before Reznov makes his next move. For the first time, Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded. The courtroom was electric as Daniel presented the new evidence. It was an unprecedented move, and the defense team immediately objected, claiming it was inadmissible. But Alicia had anticipated this. She had already obtained clearance from the president's legal counsel to declassify the key logs. This isn't just about one man's crimes, Daniel said, his voice steady as he addressed the jury. This is about national security. Viktor Reznov isn't just a hacker. He's a direct threat to the safety of this nation. And this evidence proves it. As the logs were displayed on the screen, the courtroom fell silent. The messages, decoded and presented in plain text, outlined Reznov's plan to infiltrate the Department of Defense's servers. The jury looked horrified. Even Rachel Grant, usually composed, appeared rattled. Reznov, however, remained calm, his lips curling into a faint smile. It was a smile Alicia had seen before, the smile of a man who believed he was untouchable. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was suffocating. Each tick of the clock echoed like a drumbeat, and all eyes were fixed on the screen at the front of the room. The decoded messages from Viktor Reznov's encrypted network were displayed for the jury to see. Line after line of damning evidence scrolled across the screen. each one meticulously tied to Reznov's operations. The scale of his plan was staggering. Cyber attacks targeting the Department of Defense, breaches into financial systems, and a plot to exploit vulnerabilities in the nation's energy grid. Alicia Monroe sat at the edge of her seat in the gallery, her posture calm, but her mind racing. She had spent years untangling the threads of Reznov's network, but even she felt the weight of seeing it laid bare in such a public forum. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. At the prosecution table, Daniel Cromwell's earlier bravado had faded. His voice, though steady, carried a gravity that wasn't there before. He paced slowly, deliberately as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, gesturing toward the screen, "what you see here is not just evidence. It's a blueprint for chaos. These aren't isolated incidents. These are calculated, coordinated attacks designed to destabilize our nation. And at the center of it all is Viktor Reznov." Reznov sat at the defense table, his expression calm and unreadable. But Alicia knew better. She had seen the small ticks, the tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically against the table. He was calculating, searching for a way to turn the tide. His confidence wasn't unshakable. It was a mask. Rachel Grant, Reznov's lead attorney, stood to respond. Her voice was measured, almost soothing as she tried to counter the blow. "Your Honor, while the prosecution has presented these communications as evidence, I would remind the court that correlation does not equal causation. These messages, while alarming, do not directly implicate my client without further proof of his involvement." She turned to the jury, her tone softening. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Viktor Reznov is a mastermind orchestrating these events. But where is the concrete link? Where is the direct evidence tying him to these alleged crimes?" Alicia's fingers tightened around the edge of the bench. Rachel was good, too good. She wasn't trying to deny the evidence outright. She was planting seeds of doubt. And doubt was all she needed to give Reznov a foothold. Daniel's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Alicia stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If I may address the court?" Judge Graves looked at her, her expression sharp. "Miss Monroe, you've already provided your testimony. What is the nature of this interruption?" Alicia stepped forward, her steps deliberate. She didn't look at the judge. Her eyes were fixed on Rachel Grant. "The defense claims there's no concrete link between Viktor Reznov and these communications. I'd like to provide that link." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Rachel frowned, clearly caught off guard. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Proceed," Judge Graves said, cutting her off. "But make it brief, Miss Monroe." Alicia approached the screen, pulling a small drive from her pocket. "This is a decryption log from our ongoing investigation at the NSA. It details how these messages were traced back to a secure server housed in a facility owned by Reznov Enterprises." She inserted the drive and a new set of files appeared on the screen. Alicia turned to the jury, her voice steady but commanding. "Not only does this log confirm that the messages originated from Reznov's server, but it also includes timestamps that align perfectly with his known movements. He wasn't just aware of these operations, he was directing them." Rachel stood abruptly, her voice rising. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is being introduced without proper disclosure. It's admissible," Judge Graves said, her tone firm. "Miss Monroe, continue." Alicia nodded, pulling up a series of surveillance photos. Each image showed Reznov entering or exiting the facility at critical times. "This isn't coincidence," she said, her voice unwavering. "This is coordination. Every move, every communication leads back to him." The jury's faces reflected a mix of shock and anger. The weight of the evidence was undeniable now, and even Rachel seemed to realize it. She sank back into her chair, her confident demeanor cracking. Reznov, however, remained still. His eyes were fixed on Alicia, cold and calculating. For a moment she met his gaze and the room seemed to freeze. It was a silent battle of wills, one that Alicia refused to lose. As the session adjourned for the day, Alicia stepped outside the courthouse, the crisp evening air cooling her skin. Agent Carter was waiting near the steps, his expression one of quiet triumph. "You shut them down," he said, handing her a folder. "The raids were successful. We've dismantled every piece of Reznov's network. He has nothing left to hide behind." Alicia nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "Good. Now it's just a matter of time." Carter hesitated before speaking again. "You know he's not going to take this lying down, right? Men like Reznov always have a backup plan." "I know," Alicia said quietly. "But so do we." The final day of the trial came quickly. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Alicia sat quietly in the gallery, her hands resting in her lap. This was the moment she had worked toward for years. When the jury returned, the room fell silent. The foreperson stood, holding a small piece of paper. Judge Graves addressed her, her voice steady. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." A pause. "In the case of the United States versus Viktor Reznov, we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment while Reznov sat motionless, his face an unreadable mask. But Alicia saw it, the flicker of defeat in his eyes. For the first time, he had no move left to make. Outside the courthouse, Alicia stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Daniel gave his triumphant press conference. He spoke of justice, of the strength of the legal system. But Alicia didn't care about the cameras or the accolades. She had done what she came to do. As the crowd dispersed, Carter appeared at her side. "You're not going to take any credit?" Alicia shook her head. "It's not about credit. It's about the work." Carter grinned. "Still, you saved his case, maybe even his career." "For now," Alicia said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But he'll think twice before dismissing me again." As they walked away from the courthouse, Alicia felt a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. The battle was over, but the war was never truly done. Reznov's empire was dismantled, but others would rise to take his place, and when they did, Alicia Monroe would be ready. Back at Fort Meade, Alicia sat in her office reviewing the final reports on the operation. Carter entered, a grin on his face. "You did it," he said, dropping into the chair across from her. "Reznov's done, and Cromwell got his wake-up call." Alicia leaned back in her chair, a rare moment of relaxation washing over her. "It's not about Cromwell," she said. "It's about making sure people like Reznov don't get away with this." Carter smirked. "Still, it's satisfying to see Cromwell knock down a peg." Alicia allowed herself a small laugh, maybe just a little. As the sun set outside her window, Alicia reflected on the trial. It wasn't just a victory against Reznov, it was a victory for the system, a reminder that justice required vigilance, humility, and collaboration, and as long as she was in the fight, she would ensure those principles prevailed, because that's what it meant to protect a nation. And so, the courtroom that started as a battle of egos became a stage for justice, where truth ultimately prevailed. Viktor Reznov, the mastermind who thought he was untouchable, was brought to his knees, not by arrogance but by quiet determination and relentless effort. Alicia Monroe proved that strength isn't always loud, and justice doesn't need the spotlight to shine. If this story left you intrigued, inspired, or even speechless, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. There are more stories of resilience, justice, and unexpected twists coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.